Amelia Whittaker pressed her bare hands against the stranger's bleeding side and felt the warmth of his blood soak through her fingers into the Colorado mud. He was dying right there on the road, and she was the only person who stopped. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask what he was worth. She tore the hem of her own dress and held him together through the longest night of her life. By morning, he was breathing. By sunrise, she had no job, no wages, no home, and nowhere left to go. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end, because what happens next will stay with you long after it's over. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The storm had been building since late afternoon, the kind that rolled down off the mountains with no warning and turned the Colorado flatlands into something cold and mean. Amelia Whittaker had learned to read weather the same way she'd learned to read people, quietly, carefully, and always a little too late to save herself from what was coming. She was crossing from the barn back to the main house when she heard it. Not thunder, not the wind snapping at the fence posts. Something heavier than that, a sound that didn't belong to the storm at all, a low, wet groan from somewhere down the ranch road, half swallowed by the darkness. She stopped walking. Every sensible instinct she had told her to keep moving. Thomas Caldwell had rules about the ranch hands after dark, and she had already stretched his patience thin enough that week by speaking up at supper when one of the younger boys got shorted on his wages. Caldwell didn't like women who noticed things and said so out loud. He'd made that clear when he hired her 3 years ago. "You're here to cook and clean, Miss Whittaker," he'd said, not unkindly, but with the kind of finality that didn't leave room for negotiation. Not to think. She had smiled, taken the position, and spent 3 years thinking anyway, quietly, where he couldn't see it. But the sound came again, unmistakable this time. Pain, real pain. The kind a person makes when they've been past screaming and arrived somewhere much quieter and much more frightening. Amelia changed direction. She found him 30 feet off the main road, collapsed against the base of a split-rail fence, one arm folded under his body at an angle that made her stomach drop. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, trail-worn, dressed in the kind of simple working clothes that told her nothing about who he was or where he came from. His hat had fallen a few feet away. Dark hair, strong jaw, a face that might have been handsome if it weren't so pale beneath the scruff and the blood. There was a lot of blood. It was soaking through his shirt on the left side, already going dark and thick, the kind of wound that had been bleeding long enough to matter. Amelia knelt beside him without hesitating. "Hey." She put her hand against his jaw, turned his face toward her. His eyes opened. Gray, she noticed, pale gray like winter sky. And they focused on her slowly, the way a man does when he's fighting his way back from somewhere he almost didn't return from. "Hey," she said again, softer. "I've got you. Can you hear me?" His mouth moved. "Don't." He stopped, swallowed. "Don't need." "You're bleeding badly and it's 30 degrees and dropping," she said, already pulling at the hem of her work dress with both hands. "So whatever you were about to say, I need you to save it for later." The fabric tore cleanly. She folded it into a compress, pressed it hard against the wound, and watched his face go white with pain before he got his jaw set against it. "Who did this?" she asked. He didn't answer. "How long ago?" Still nothing. But his hand came up, slowly, like it cost him something, and pressed over hers against the wound, helping her hold pressure, telling her, in the only language he had left, that he was still in there. "All right," Amelia said. "All right. You don't have to talk. Just stay awake for me." She worked in the darkness for a long time. She used what she had, the torn hem, her coat, a length of rope she found caught on the fence post, and she talked to him the whole while, not because she expected answers, but because she'd learned a long time ago that a voice keeps people tethered. Her mother had told her that. Her mother had told her a great many things in the last weeks of her life, when talking was all she had the strength left for. Never walk away from someone who needs help, Amelia. The world has enough people who look away. Don't you become one of them. She hadn't. She wouldn't start tonight. By the time she had the wound bound tight enough to hold, the rain had started in earnest. She pulled her coat, what remained of it, around his shoulders and sat beside him in the mud with his head resting against her knee. And she stayed that way until the worst of the bleeding had slowed, and his breathing had evened out enough to tell her he was going to make it to morning. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what he'd been doing on Caldwell's Road at that hour, or who had hurt him, or why. She just knew he was alive when he hadn't been planning to be, and that was enough for the moment. What she didn't know was that Thomas Caldwell had been watching from his front porch for the better part of an hour. She found that out just before dawn, when the rain had softened to a drizzle and the stranger's breathing had gone slow and steady enough that she'd finally let herself believe the worst was past. She heard the creak of boot leather on wet ground behind her and turned to find Caldwell standing 6 feet away with a lantern in one hand and an expression on his face that she recognized immediately. Not anger. Something colder than anger. Disappointment. The kind that had already made a decision and was simply here to deliver it. "Miss Whitaker." His voice was flat. "Get away from him." She didn't move. "He's badly hurt, Mr. Caldwell. He's not going to be able to—" "I said get away." Amelia stayed where she was. "He'll start bleeding again if I move before—" "He is not my problem." Caldwell took a step forward, the lantern swinging. "And as of this moment, neither are you." The words landed like something physical. She felt them in her chest, that particular kind of blow that doesn't break anything, but leaves a mark you carry for years. "You're letting me go," she said. "Not a question." "Consider yourself fortunate. I'm letting you leave on your own feet." His jaw was tight. "I don't know who that man is, or what trouble he's brought onto my property. I won't have it. And I won't have a woman on my staff who drags dying strangers in off the road without a thought for the consequences." "He would have died," Amelia said. "That," Caldwell told her, "is not your concern." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 3 years. 3 years of early mornings and late nights, of meals cooked and floors scrubbed, and never once asking for more than she was given. 3 years of making herself small and quiet and useful, and telling herself that was enough, that it was building toward something, that patience eventually paid out. She thought about her wages, 2 weeks of them, owed to her. She thought about the room she kept above the kitchen, the small box of her mother's letters she kept under the bed, the winter coat she would need badly in about 4 more hours when the temperature dropped again. She thought about all of it. And then she looked down at the man she'd spent the night keeping alive, and she thought about what her mother had said. "My wages," she said quietly. "I'm owed 2 weeks." Caldwell's expression didn't change. "I'll consider the use of my property and my fence materials a sufficient settlement." He meant the rope. He was counting the rope. Amelia stood. She did it slowly, carefully, making sure the compress she'd constructed would hold before she moved. She picked up her small bag. She'd had it with her when she went to the barn, by some luck or instinct, or simply the habit of a woman who had learned not to leave valuables unwatched. And she looked at Thomas Caldwell one final time. "You're going to regret this," she said. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't something she'd planned to say. It came out quiet and certain, the way true things sometimes do, and she meant it not as revenge, but simply as fact. She believed it the way she believed in weather coming down off the mountains. You could see it from a long way off, if you knew how to look. Caldwell said nothing. He just raised the lantern a fraction and held it steady, lighting her way off his property. She went. She was 3 steps down the road when she heard the stranger's voice behind her. Rough, low, barely there at all, but clear enough to carry. "Ma'am." She stopped. "I heard," he said. "What he said to you." Amelia didn't turn around. "Then you have a sense of what kind of night this has been." A pause. Then, "What's your name?" She considered not answering. She was cold. She was broke. She was standing on a ranch road at 4 in the morning with everything she owned fitting in one hand, and she did not particularly feel like small talk. But her mother had also told her that courtesy costs nothing, even when everything else is expensive. "Amelia," she said. "Amelia Whitaker." Another pause, longer this time. Long enough that she thought he'd lost consciousness again. "Benjamin," he said finally. Benjamin Hartwell. The name meant nothing to her. Not then. She nodded once, even though her back was to him, and walked on into the dark. She reached Red Hollow by mid-morning, when the sun had finally burned the clouds off and the streets were waking up, and nobody gave a second glance to a woman walking in with a torn coat and a face that had clearly seen a rough night. That was one of the things about frontier towns. They had a short memory for other people's hard times, which could feel like cruelty from the outside, but functioned sometimes as its own kind of grace. She had $4.11 in her bag. The wages she was owed were gone. She had accepted that somewhere on the walk-in, let herself grieve it for about a mile, and then put it away. Because grief was a luxury she couldn't hold on to right now, and walking was something she could actually do. She needed work. She needed it fast, because $4.11 had a specific distance it could carry a person, and she had learned long ago not to pretend otherwise. Red Hollow had 3 boarding houses, 2 saloons, a general store, a livery, a small church, and a woman named Margaret Ellis, who ran the best of the boarding houses and was known throughout the county for having opinions about everything and being right about most of them. Amelia found Margaret Ellis behind the boarding house, fighting with a sheet that the wind kept taking, and introduced herself. "I need work," Amelia said. "I cook well. I clean thoroughly. I don't complain, and I don't steal." Margaret Ellis looked her over the way an experienced woman looks at another woman who's been through something, with attention, without pity. "Caldwell's girl?" she said. Amelia blinked. "I was employed at the Caldwell Ranch, yes. Heard he had a good cook." Margaret got the sheet pinned down with the economy of someone who'd won this argument with wind 1,000 times. "Heard he was a fool who didn't know what he had. Those 2 things aren't mutually exclusive." She picked up her basket. "You get a room above the kitchen and 2 meals a day. The pay is modest, but it's reliable. You start this afternoon if you want to start." "I want to start," Amelia said. "Then come inside." Margaret turned for the door and then paused, one hand on the frame. "I heard about last night, about the man on the road and what Caldwell did after." She didn't look back, just spoke to the open doorway. "What you did was right. I want you to know that somebody in this valley thinks so." Amelia didn't trust herself to speak for a moment. She pressed her lips together, breathed through it, and when her voice was steady again, she said, "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't thank me," Margaret said. "Just come inside and let's see what kind of work you've actually got in you." She had a great deal of it, as it turned out. The boarding house had 6 rooms, all occupied by the kind of working men who left before dawn and came back after dark, and wanted their supper hot and their clothes clean, and otherwise wanted to be left alone. Amelia fed them, and washed for them, and kept the place running with the quiet efficiency she'd spent 3 years developing, and in the spaces between, the long quiet hours after midnight when the house was settled, she thought about what came next. She was 31 years old. She had $4.11, now $3.70, after a pair of wool stockings she'd needed badly. She had a narrow bed and a borrowed blanket and the complete absence of anyone in the world who required her to be somewhere. She had built something from nothing before. She could do it again. What she could not have predicted, what no amount of quiet midnight planning could have prepared her for, was the afternoon, 3 weeks later, when she came around the corner from the kitchen with a tray of coffee cups and found Benjamin Hartwell sitting at Margaret Ellis's dining table. He looked different. Clean clothes, color back in his face, that gray gaze clear and steady in a way it hadn't been when she'd last seen it, fighting its way up from somewhere dark. He was broader than she'd registered in the dark, the kind of big that came from real work, not display. He had his hat on the table in front of him, and he was turning it in his hands, slowly, the way people do when they're working up to something. He looked up when she came in, stood immediately, the way a man does when he's been raised to show a woman that kind of respect and means it. "Miss Whitaker," he said. Amelia stopped, set the tray down carefully on the sideboard, looked at him. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, "you look considerably better than the last time I saw you." "I feel considerably better." He didn't sit back down until she had taken her own seat across from him, which told her something about him. "I've been trying to find you for 3 weeks. You found me." "I did." He was quiet for a moment, that it's still turning in his hands. I want to thank you, properly. What you did, staying with me that night, I know what it cost you. You heard the conversation, Amelia said. I did. Then you know exactly what it cost me. She poured coffee into 2 cups without asking, because she'd been feeding people long enough to know that a warm cup in someone's hands helped whatever conversation came next. And if you've come to offer me money, I want you to know right now that I'll refuse it. Benjamin's hands stilled on the hat. He looked at her carefully. Why? Because I didn't do it for money. And if I take money for it now, it changes what it was. She lifted her own cup. I'm not interested in changing what it was. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that happens when one person has surprised another person in a way they weren't expecting, and now they need a moment to recalibrate. All right, Benjamin said finally. No money. Good. He took a slow breath. Then let me ask you something different. He looked up from the hat, met her eyes, and she noticed again how direct his gaze was. The particular quality of a man who had learned that looking away from things didn't make them easier to deal with. What happened that night on Caldwell's Road? The attack. Do you know what I was doing there? Amelia set her cup down. I don't. But I wondered. I was investigating, he said. I've had reports, from several families in this valley, that someone is using forged land documents to push small ranchers off their property. Families who've been here 20 years, 30 years. Working land they built. Someone is systematically falsifying records, getting those families into legal disputes they don't have the resources to fight, and buying their land for next to nothing when they can't sustain the battle. Amelia said nothing, but she was listening the way she listened when something mattered, with her whole self, perfectly still. The men who attacked me knew I was getting close to finding the paper trail, Benjamin continued. They wanted to stop the investigation before it went any further. They nearly succeeded, she said. They did, he agreed. Until you. She looked at him steadily. What are you going to do about it? I'm going to finish what I started. He set the hat down flat on the table, both hands palm down on either side of it. The gesture of a man who has made a decision and is done weighing it. But I'm going to need help. Someone with sharp eyes and a good head for records and documents. Someone who knows how to organize information and isn't afraid to ask the questions that matter. He paused. Someone the families in this valley might actually trust to be on their side. Amelia studied him. You're not talking about a thank you, she said. No, ma'am. You're talking about a job. I'm talking about a partnership, he said, with fair wages. On your terms, not mine. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up again off the mountains, and the familiar sounds of the boarding house settling around her. The creak of the upstairs floor, the knock of a door, the distant clang of the livery down the street. 3 weeks ago, she'd walked into this town with $4 and a torn coat and the absolute requirement that she figure out what came next. She had done that. She had rebuilt herself, quietly and competently, the way she always had. But this was not the same thing as what Benjamin Hartwell was offering. This was something she had never been offered before. I need to know one more thing, she said. Ask it. The families who are losing their land, do you actually care what happens to them? Or is this about the investigation? About finding the men who attacked you? She held his gaze. Because those are different things, and I need to know which one is driving this before I decide. Benjamin Hartwell looked at her for a long moment, and then quietly he said, Both. They can both be true. She considered that. Yes, she said. They can. She picked up her coffee cup. Tell me what you know about the land records, she said. From the beginning. Everything. And Benjamin Hartwell leaned forward, set his hat aside, and started to talk. Outside, the Colorado sky was doing that thing it did in late afternoon, going gold and deep blue at the edges, the mountains catching light in a way that made everything feel, briefly, like the world was holding its breath before something changed. Amelia didn't notice the sky. She was already working, already turning over what he was telling her, finding the places where the story had holes and the places where it was solid. building the shape of it in her mind, the way her mother had taught her to build anything. From the ground up, carefully, with both hands. She did not think about Benjamin Hartwell as anything other than the man she was going to help get justice for those families. That would change. But not yet. Not yet. Benjamin Hartwell spread the papers across Margaret Ellis's dining table, the way a man lays out evidence he's been carrying too long. Carefully, deliberately, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has looked at the same problem from every angle and still hasn't found the clean way through it. There were deed records, survey maps, a series of letters with official territorial seals that Amelia recognized immediately as the kind of documents that looked genuine until you held them next to something you knew was real, and then the difference became quietly, devastatingly obvious. She picked up the first deed without asking permission. "This transfer date," she said, "October 1876. That's what it says. The Territorial Land Office didn't begin using this seal format until March of 1877. She set it down, picked up the second one. "And this surveyor's signature, Thomas Aldrich? You know him?" "I know of him. He died in the winter of 1875. She laid it beside the first. "Someone is signing his name to documents dated 2 years after he was buried." The silence that followed had weight to it. Benjamin watched her work through the stack with the focused attention of a man who has just realized the person across the table is considerably more formidable than he'd anticipated, and is recalibrating accordingly. "How do you know that?" he asked. "About Aldrich. Margaret Ellis keeps records going back 20 years. Every transaction, every deed transfer, every significant event in this valley. She's been here longer than anyone." Amelia set the papers down in a neat row and looked up. "She lent me her ledgers when I first arrived. I read them because I needed to understand where I'd landed. You read 20 years of land records in 3 weeks. I had quiet nights and nothing better to do." She pulled the third document toward her. "Tell me about the families, the ones who are losing their land. How many?" "6 that I know of." He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. "Names, dates, acreage. Possibly more. The ones I know about came to me. There are almost certainly others who don't know yet that what's happening to them isn't an accident." Amelia looked at the list. 6 families. 6 sets of lives built on land they'd broken their backs to work, now being quietly dismantled by someone with enough legal knowledge to make forgery look like paperwork. "The Dunmore family," she said. "They're on here. You know them?" "Ruth Dunmore brings eggs to the boarding house every Thursday." Amelia set the list down carefully. "She hasn't said a word about any of this. She probably doesn't understand what's happening," Benjamin said. "That's the genius of it, from the swindler's perspective. By the time these families realize the land dispute is fraudulent, they're already deep in legal proceedings they can't afford. The lawyers cost money they don't have. The court dates keep getting continued. The pressure builds until they accept whatever settlement is offered just to stop bleeding." He paused. "The settlements are always about 30 cents on the dollar. And who is buying?" He hesitated, just briefly, a fraction of a second, but she caught it. "You know," she said, "I have a strong suspicion." "That's not the same as knowing." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She studied him. "You're protecting someone." "I'm protecting an investigation," he said, and his voice was level, but his jaw had tightened by a degree she noticed. "If I name the wrong man based on incomplete evidence, I lose the ability to prosecute the right one. These families deserve more than a botched case." Amelia considered that. It was a reasonable position. It was also the position of a man who had been moving carefully for a long time and had been attacked for it, which told her the person he suspected was dangerous enough to send men out to do violence on a dark road. "All right," she said. "What do you need from me?" He looked at her steadily. "I need someone to talk to Ruth Dunmore and the other families on that list. I need to know what documents they were shown, what they were told, who delivered the legal notices. I need a complete picture of how this operation works from the receiving end." He paused. "And I need someone those families will actually talk to. They've had enough of men in good coats arriving with official papers. They're not going to tell me anything I couldn't have guessed." Amelia was quiet for a moment. Ruth Dunmore is going to cry, she said, when she finds out what's being done to her. Probably. And then she's going to be angry. That's what I'm counting on, Benjamin said. That was when Amelia made her decision. Not because of the wages he'd offered, not because of what she owed him or what he'd done to find her. She made it because Ruth Dunmore brought eggs every Thursday and had never once complained, and there was something about the quiet endurance of a woman who is being systematically robbed without knowing it that Amelia Whittaker found completely intolerable. I'll start tomorrow, she said. She started the next morning. Ruth Dunmore's reaction was exactly what Amelia had predicted, and twice as hard to sit through. She went pale first, then red, then pale again, pressing both hands flat against her kitchen table, like she needed to feel something solid under them while the world shifted. They told me it was a boundary dispute, Ruth said. Her voice was careful, the way voices get when a person is holding something fragile and knows it. They said the original survey was in error, that the eastern 30 acres were never legally ours. They weren't in error, Amelia said. I've seen the original survey. Thomas Aldrich filed it correctly in 1871, and every record from that office confirms it. The document they showed you is a forgery. Ruth stared at her. You can prove that. I can show you the discrepancies. Whether a court will act on them is a different question. But yes, the evidence is there. Ruth Dunmore sat down heavily in her kitchen chair and looked at her hands for a long moment. And then she looked up, and what Amelia saw in her face was not grief or fear. It was something harder and colder than either. Who? She said. Amelia shook her head. We don't have a name yet, but we're working on it. We, Ruth repeated. You and that Hartwell man. Word traveled fast in small valleys. Amelia filed that away. Yes. Ruth was quiet. Then, my husband built that barn with his own hands. 30 years ago. He was 24 years old, and he built every inch of it himself because we couldn't afford to hire anyone. She pressed her lips together. He's been gone 12 years. That land is all I have left of him. I know, Amelia said, and she meant it. Not as a pleasantry, not as comfort, but as a statement of fact. She knew exactly what it was to have something be all that remained of someone you'd loved. Then help me keep it, Ruth said. By the end of that week, Amelia had spoken to 4 of the 6 families on Benjamin's list. Each conversation was different, and each one was the same initial incomprehension, the same dawning horror, the same anger settling in like something that had found a permanent place to live. She took notes. She recorded every document they'd been shown, every name they'd been given, every date and detail and offhand remark, and she brought it all back to Margaret Ellis's dining table each evening and laid it out next to what Benjamin was gathering from his own channels. The pattern became clear on a Thursday evening when the rain was back and they were both leaning over the table with coffee going cold beside them, and Amelia lined up the delivery dates of the fraudulent notices against the schedule of the county land office. Every single notice was delivered on a day when the land registrar was out of the office, she said. Everyone. The deputy registrar processed them, and the deputy registrar is Harold Fitch, Benjamin said. They looked at each other. How long have you known? Amelia asked. I've suspected Fitch for 6 weeks. But suspicion isn't evidence. He looked at the lineup she'd assembled. That is. It's circumstantial. It's a start. He straightened up. Fitch isn't the top of this. He's capable enough to process paperwork, but the legal architecture of these forgeries requires someone with real training. A lawyer, or someone who's studied enough law to know where the seams are. Amelia thought about that. She thought about it all the way through clearing the table and all through the long, quiet evening after, sitting with her small box of her mother's letters on her narrow bed above the kitchen, turning over what she knew and what she didn't. She thought about a particular name that had come up twice in the documents Benjamin had shown her. Not in a prominent place. In the margins, almost. The kind of place a careful person puts their name when they want to be able to claim involvement without being front and center when things go wrong. In the morning, she put it in front of Benjamin before he'd finished his first cup of coffee. Elias Croft, she said. Benjamin went very still. He's a land attorney, she continued. He's represented several of the parties in these disputes. He was appointed to the position of county land commissioner 8 months ago, which is, I notice, approximately 2 months before the first forged document appears in the record. She paused. He also served on the territorial bar committee that standardized the seal format in March of 1877, which means he knew exactly what those seals should look like and how to replicate them. Benjamin set his coffee cup down. "Amelia," he said, "that's exactly who I've been trying not to name without proof." "I know," she said. "That's why I found you some." She laid the documents out. Not copies, not reconstructions, but original papers that had passed through enough hands that their chain of custody was clean. The margin notations in Croft's handwriting. The dates that aligned with his appointment. A letter, found in the county records, filed incorrectly, the kind of thing only someone reading everything would ever notice. That referenced a land parcel by its fraudulent boundary description 3 weeks before that description appeared in any official document. Benjamin read through it twice. He did not rush. He was the kind of man who understood that being thorough now prevented catastrophe later, and she respected that about him the way she had come to respect a number of things about him over these past weeks. His patience, his directness, the way he never once talked down to her or softened information because he thought she couldn't handle it. "This is enough to go to the federal marshal," he said. "I think so. This is also enough to get us both killed if Croft finds out we have it before we can act on it." He looked up. "You understand that?" "I understand it." She met his eyes. "I also understand that Ruth Dunmore is scheduled to appear in a land court proceeding in 3 weeks, and if we don't act before then, she's going to lose that 30 acres that's all she has left of her husband." Benjamin held her gaze for a long moment. "You're not afraid." "I'm terrified," Amelia said. "But that's a separate matter." Something shifted in his expression. She couldn't quite read it. Something that wasn't quite surprise, and wasn't quite admiration. Something quieter, and more careful than either. "I need to contact the federal marshal's office," he said. "That's a 2-day ride to Denver, and I can't send a letter. Croft has a man at the post office. I'm almost certain of it." "Then go," Amelia said. "I'll keep gathering here, and I'll keep the documents safe." He looked at her steadily. "These need to be somewhere Croft's people can't easily find them." "I'll give them to Margaret Ellis," Amelia said. "She's been in this valley longer than anyone, and she keeps her own records locked in a strong box that she has never, in 20 years, allowed anyone else to touch." She paused. "She also sleeps with the Colt revolver under her pillow, which I feel is relevant." Benjamin's mouth did something that, on a less composed man, might have been called a smile. "You've given this some thought." "I've been thinking about nothing else for 2 days," she said. "Go to Denver. I'll be here when you get back." He left before noon. She watched him ride out from the boarding house window and then turned back to the table, which was covered in documents she now understood better than anyone except the man who'd created them, and she sat down and got back to work. The next 48 hours were quiet, in the way that quiet becomes suspicious once you understand what's moving underneath it. Amelia went about her work at the boarding house, the meals, the laundry, the ordinary machinery of the place, and in the spaces between she organized, cross-referenced, cataloged. She was building something that could stand up in a federal proceeding, and she was building it the way her mother had taught her to build anything worth having. Methodically, without shortcuts, with enough redundancy that no single point of failure could bring it down. She gave the originals to Margaret Ellis on the second morning and kept meticulous copies herself. And on the second afternoon, Harold Fitch walked into the boarding house. She was in the front parlor when he came in, and she recognized him immediately. She'd identified him from Benjamin's description and from the county records, where his signature appeared on every fraudulent processing stamp. He was a small man, careful in his movements, the kind of person who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. He looked around the parlor with the casual air of a man who has stopped in for no particular reason, and it was the specific quality of that casualness, too deliberate, too practiced, that told her this was not a coincidence. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "is Mrs. Ellis available?" "She's occupied," Amelia said. "Can I help you with something?" "I'm looking for a Mr. Hartwell. I understand he's been staying in the area." Amelia kept her expression completely neutral. She had learned a long time ago that the most useful thing a woman could be, in the presence of a man who didn't know what she knew, was exactly as unremarkable as he expected her to be. "I've seen a few travelers through here," she said. "Can't say I know a Hartwell. Does he have business with Mrs. Ellis?" Fitch looked at her. His eyes were sharper than his manner suggested, and she noted that carefully. He might have left some papers," Fitch said, "for safekeeping." There it was, right there, out in the open, dressed up as a casual inquiry from a helpful county official. "I wouldn't know anything about that," Amelia said pleasantly. "But I can let Mrs. Ellis know you stopped by. Your name?" He told her. She wrote it down in the small notebook she kept in her apron pocket. She had carried a notebook in her apron pocket since she was 18 years old, and it had never been more useful than in the last 2 weeks. She smiled and thanked him and watched him leave. The moment the door closed behind him, she walked directly to Margaret Ellis's kitchen. "Harold Fitch was just here," she said. "He knows about the papers, or he suspects." Margaret Ellis looked up from her bread dough. "Does he?" "He was fishing. He didn't find anything." She paused. "But they know Benjamin has been investigating. They know he's been in Red Hollow. It's only a matter of time before they connect the dots back to me." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron. She was 62 years old, had been in this valley since before it had a name worth putting on a map, and she looked at Amelia now with the calm, clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had outlasted a considerable number of crises. "Then we'd better make sure there's nothing for them to find," she said. "I'll move the papers tonight. There's a place under the church floorboards that's been keeping secrets since 1863. It can keep a few more." "Margaret." Amelia stopped, started again. "You don't have to be part of this. You didn't ask to be." "No," Margaret said, going back to her bread. "But you're in my house, and those families are my neighbors. And Elias Croft sat at my dining table 3 years ago and told me what a fine and upstanding man he was." She pressed her hands into the dough with perhaps slightly more force than the recipe required. "I've been wanting to do something about that ever since. This seems like an appropriate opportunity." Amelia looked at her for a moment. There was a specific kind of gratitude that ran too deep for words. The kind you feel when someone chooses to stand beside you for no reason other than that it's right, with full knowledge of what it costs. She had experienced it twice in her life. Once when her mother sat up with her through a fever that nearly took her at 16. And now. "Thank you," she said. "Stop thanking me and help me finish this bread," Margaret said. "We'll move the papers after supper when the street is quiet." They moved the papers at 9 o'clock that night. Amelia was back in the boarding house by 10. She lay awake in her narrow bed and thought about Benjamin somewhere on the road to Denver, about Ruth Dunmore's hands pressed flat on her kitchen table, about Elias Croft signing his name in the margins of documents that were destroying people's lives, about Harold Fitch's sharp eyes in his carefully unremarkable face. She thought about what her mother would say if she could see this. She thought her mother would say exactly what she'd always said, in the particular way she had of stating the obvious as if it were news. "You already know what needs to be done. You're just waiting for permission you don't need." She closed her eyes. Benjamin came back on the 4th day instead of the 2nd, riding into Red Hollow in the late afternoon, with a tightness around his eyes that she recognized as the particular strain of a man who has learned something he wasn't prepared for. She met him at the door before he could knock. "What happened?" she said. He stepped inside. He waited until Margaret had closed the kitchen door and they were alone in the parlor before he answered. "The federal marshal's office has been aware of the land fraud scheme for 4 months," he said. "They've been building their own case, quietly, without telling anyone in the affected counties." He looked at her steadily. "Because they believe there's a second player in this, someone above Croft. Someone with enough influence in the territorial government to have been intercepting complaints before they reached the right authorities." Amelia sat down. "How far up does this go?" she asked. Benjamin looked at her. "We don't know yet," he said. "But we're about to find out." And that was when Amelia understood that what they'd been working on, the fraud, the documents, the families, was not the whole picture. It was the bottom of something much larger and much darker, and they were standing right at the edge of it, with the federal marshal's blessing and no clear view of what waited below. She picked up her notebook. "Tell me everything they told you," she said. "From the beginning, every word." And outside, somewhere down the street, the lights in Elias Croft's office window went out for the night. The federal marshal's name was James Calloway, and Benjamin had met him in a back room of a Denver hotel that didn't appear in any official record of the meeting, because, as Calloway had explained with the particular weariness of a man who had been doing this work too long, some conversations needed to happen before they could be acknowledged as having happened at all. Amelia listened to every word Benjamin told her. She didn't interrupt. She didn't reach for her notebook until he'd finished, and when he was done, she sat still for a moment, letting the full weight of what he'd said settle. "So Croft isn't running this," she said. "He's executing it." Calloway's words were that Croft is the instrument, not the hand holding it. Benjamin sat down across from her. He looked tired in a way that 4 days of hard riding didn't fully account for. The kind of tired that comes from discovering a problem is twice the size you'd calculated. There's someone coordinating this across at least 3 counties. The same pattern appears in Larimer County and in Pueblo. Different deputies, different local attorneys, same method. Forged surveys, fraudulent deed transfers, legal proceedings timed to exhaust the families financially, and the territorial government connection, Amelia said. Calloway believes someone at the territorial land commissioner level has been flagging complaints before they reach federal review, rerouting them back to county jurisdiction, where they die quietly. He paused. He wouldn't give me a name. He said the investigation is at a stage where naming the wrong person destroys everything. He said the same thing you said, Amelia observed. Because it's true. She opened her notebook. What does he need from us? Benjamin looked at her. He needs the original documents. The ones with the margin notations, the forged surveyor signatures, the processing stamps. He needs a complete evidentiary package that can support a federal case. Something clean enough that a territorial court can't dismiss it on procedural grounds. We have that, Amelia said. He stilled. You have it already. Margaret moved the originals the night Fitch came to the boarding house. They're in a location I'm not going to name out loud in case anyone is listening at Windows. She turned a page in her notebook. I have complete copies here, cross-referenced against the original county survey records, with annotations identifying the specific discrepancies in each fraudulent document. She looked up. I've also built a timeline. Every fraudulent notice, every land court date, every processing stamp, plotted against Croft's appointment as land commissioner, the dates he would have had access to the official seal, and the schedule of Fitch's supervisory absences. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment. Amelia, he said, when did you sleep? Adequately, she said. Do you want to see the timeline or not? He looked at what she laid out in front of him with the expression of a man who is recalibrating something fundamental, not about the evidence, but about the person who assembled it. She noticed and said nothing, because she had learned a long time ago that the most effective response to being underestimated was simply to keep working until the evidence made the argument for her. He studied the timeline for a long time. He asked 3 questions, sharp and specific, and she answered all 3 without hesitating. Then he sat back. This is better than what Calloway's office has, he said. I assumed as much, she said. They've been investigating from the top down. They know the architecture, but not the ground-level execution. We've been working from the bottom up. She closed her notebook. We should send a writer to Denver. Not through the post office. I know a man, Benjamin said. He's reliable, and he has no connection to Croft or to any county official. Then send him tonight. She paused. Ruth Dunmore's hearing is in 19 days. Calloway needs to move before then, or she loses that land regardless of what we prove afterward. Benjamin nodded. He was already reaching for his coat. One more thing, Amelia said. He stopped. The second player, the one above Croft. She held his gaze. You have a name, don't you? You've had one for a while. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. She counted them. What makes you say that? Because you went to Denver to go to the federal marshal, and the federal marshal told you things he shouldn't have told a private citizen unless he already trusted you, and you don't get that kind of trust from a man like Calloway without a prior relationship. She paused. And because when I said Croft's name to you 2 weeks ago, you went still in a very specific way. Not surprised, not relieved. Confirmed. Benjamin looked at her steadily. His name is Arthur Vane, he said. He's a territorial land commissioner appointed out of Washington 18 months ago. He controls land review authority for the entire southern half of the territory. He paused. He also has significant political connections that make him extremely difficult to move without ironclad evidence. Does Calloway know? He suspects. He doesn't have the proof to act. Amelia picked up her notebook again. She didn't open it yet, just held it in both hands, thinking. What is Vane's connection to the land being acquired? She said. These families 30 acres, 50 acres. They're not significant individually. What does Vane want with parcels of frontier ranch land? Benjamin reached into his coat and produced a folded map. He spread it on the table. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad is surveying a southern route through Colorado. The projected line runs directly through a corridor of land that includes every parcel currently being targeted in these fraud schemes. Amelia looked at the map. She looked at the line of the projected route. She looked at the cluster of fraudulent land transfers, which she now saw were not scattered. They were aligned. A deliberate pattern. A land corridor being quietly assembled, parcel by parcel, from families who didn't know what their land was about to be worth. He's acquiring the railroad right-of-way, she said. At 30 cents on the dollar, Benjamin said. Before the route is publicly announced. When it is announced, whoever holds that land corridor will be able to name their price to the railroad. She set the notebook down. That's not land fraud, she said. That's a federal crime 3 times over. Which is why Calloway needs what we have, and why Vane cannot find out we have it before Calloway can act. They sat with that between them for a moment. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, the boarding house had settled into its nighttime stillness. You should have told me about Vane from the beginning, Amelia said. I know. He didn't make excuses for it. She respected that. If I'd known the full scope of this 2 weeks ago, I would have built the evidentiary package differently. I would have included the railroad survey information as... She stopped, started again. Actually, I can rebuild it. I can reconstruct the timeline with the railroad route overlaid and show the geographic alignment explicitly. That turns a land fraud case into an evidence of coordinated federal conspiracy. Can you do that in time? Give me 2 days, she said. The rider left for Denver before dawn. Amelia worked through the night with her lamp turned low, rebuilding the evidentiary case from the ground up with the railroad route information integrated into the timeline. The documents took shape under her hands with the particular clarity that comes at 3 in the morning when tiredness burns away everything except the essential, the clean line of fact, the undeniable geometry of evidence when it's assembled correctly. By the second morning, what she had was not a collection of documents. It was an argument. A precise, devastating, procedurally airtight argument that told the story of what Vane and Croft and Fitch had done from the first forged seal to the last manipulated hearing date, and it told it in the language of evidence rather than accusation. She showed it to Benjamin over coffee. He read it without speaking. She watched his face and saw the moment he understood the full scope of what she'd built. Not just the facts, but the architecture. The way the pieces fit together to make something inescapable. This will hold, he said. It will hold, she agreed. A territorial court could throw it out on jurisdiction grounds, which is why the cover letter addresses federal jurisdiction explicitly, cites the 3 applicable sections of the federal land fraud statute, and includes a formal request for emergency injunction on the active land court proceedings. She picked up the final page. I'm not a lawyer, but I was the daughter of a woman who believed that a person with access to a good law library and enough time could understand anything. She set the page down. The church in Red Hollow has an excellent law library. I've been using it for a week. Benjamin looked at her across the table. That quality was back in his expression, the one she'd been seeing more of lately and hadn't fully let herself examine, because examining it required thinking about things she'd been deliberately not thinking about. "Amelia," he said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "I own the Hartwell Ranch Company," he said. 12,000 acres across 3 counties. One of the largest cattle operations in the territory. He said it the way people say things they've been holding back. Not with pride, not with apology, but with the particular relief of putting something heavy down. "The man you found bleeding in the mud is not a working cowboy. He has a house with 8 rooms and a staff of 30 and a bank account that would embarrass most men I know." Amelia looked at him. She thought about the moment she'd understood he wasn't who he'd presented himself as. Not in any dramatic sense, but in the quiet accumulation of small observations over these past weeks. The way he moved through a room. The particular confidence of a man who has never had to wonder whether he could afford something. The fact that Calloway and Denver had met with him personally rather than sending a letter. "I know," she said. He blinked. "You know. I've known for about 10 days. She picked up her coffee. "Margaret told me. She recognized your name the day you arrived." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because it didn't change anything." She looked at him steadily. "You came back to find me, not to offer me money. You already tried that and I said no. You came back because of the families on that list, and because of what happened on that road, and because—" She paused, chose her next words carefully. "Because I think you've spent a long time being surrounded by people who only see the 12,000 acres, and you didn't know what to do with someone who just saw a man bleeding in a ditch." Benjamin didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup, then back at her, and there was something in his face that she recognized as the expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just been unexpectedly offered the chance to set it down. "That's exactly right," he said. "That's exactly what it was." She nodded. "Well, now I know about the 12,000 acres, and it still doesn't change anything." She opened her notebook. "We have 19, now 16, days before Ruth Dunmore's hearing. Let's talk about what needs to happen between now and then. That should have been a clean path forward. 16 days, a solid evidentiary package, a federal marshal already aware and positioned to act. In a story without Elias Croft's intelligence network and Arthur Vane's willingness to protect his investment, it might have been enough. But Croft found out on day 4. Amelia didn't know how. She suspected Fitch, who had sharper eyes than anyone gave him credit for, or possibly one of the boarding house's regular lodgers who'd overheard more than he let on. However it happened, the effect was immediate and specific. A legal notice arrived at the boarding house addressed to Margaret Ellis, informing her that she was under formal investigation by the county land office for alleged irregularities in the deeds of the property on which the boarding house stood. Margaret read it at the breakfast table, set it face down next to her coffee cup, and said, "Well, that's what we call a declaration of war." "He's going after you," Amelia said, "because you're sheltering us." "He's trying to frighten me," Margaret corrected. "There's a difference." She picked up the notice again, examined it. "This is also extremely sloppy work. The irregularities he's citing are from a boundary adjustment made in 1869 that was legally resolved in 1871. If Croft is reaching back that far, he's desperate." Amelia took the notice from her and read it. Her eyes went to the processing stamp, to the date, to the deputy signature. "This wasn't processed by Fitch," she said. Margaret looked at her sharply. "The stamp is from the county clerk's office, not the land registrar." Amelia set the paper down. "Croft has someone else, a second contact in a different office." "How many people does he have?" Margaret said. "I don't know, but this tells me something important." Amelia reached for her notebook. "He's escalating. He used Fitch for the original fraud because it was slow and careful work. He's using the county clerk now because he needs to move fast. Something scared him." "The rider to Denver," Benjamin said from the doorway. He'd heard the last part. He came in and looked at the notice on the table. "Somehow he knows we sent information to Calloway." They looked at each other across the table. "The rider," Amelia said quietly. "He was followed." "Or he talked," Margaret said, with the flat pragmatism of a woman who didn't place excessive faith in human reliability. "It doesn't matter which," Benjamin said. "What matters is that Croft knows we have evidence and that we've made contact with the federal office. He's going to move on the remaining families before Calloway can act." He looked at Amelia. The hearing dates. She already had her notebook open. Ruth Dunmore in 15 days. The Kellerman family in 11. The Hargrove claim. That one is the most vulnerable. They have a hearing in 7 days. 7 days, Benjamin repeated. "We need Calloway here," Amelia said. "Not in Denver reviewing documents. Here in person, with the authority to issue an emergency injunction before the Hargrove hearing." She paused. "The package we sent. Is it enough for him to act?" "It should be, but Calloway is careful. Then we need to make careful impossible." She looked down at her notes, at the timeline, at the clean line of evidence she'd spent 2 nights building. "There's one piece we haven't used yet. The railroad survey documents, the projected route map, the internal correspondence from the Denver and Rio Grande office. If we can get those in front of Calloway directly, it upgrades the charge from land fraud to conspiracy against federal railroad interests." She looked up. "That's not something he can be careful about. That requires immediate action." "Those documents are in Denver," Benjamin said, "in the railroad company's offices. Do you have a contact there?" He was quiet for a beat. "I have an investor's relationship with the Denver and Rio Grande. I hold a minor stake in the southern expansion." Amelia stared at him. "You have a financial interest in the railroad you're investigating fraud against." "A very minor stake," he said, with what she felt was insufficient contrition. "Benjamin Hartwell." She set her pen down. "Is there anything else you've forgotten to mention?" He had the decency to look genuinely apologetic. "The railroad investment was before I understood the scope of what Vane was doing. When I put it together, I divested, but I still have relationships there." She picked up her pen. "Use them. Get us those internal route documents." She paused. "And going forward, I would appreciate complete disclosure." "Understood." He was already moving toward the door. "I'll telegraph the Denver and Rio Grande office today." "Use the livery owner's telegraph, not the post office," she said. "Croft's man is at the post office." He stopped, turned back, looked at her with that expression again, the one she kept not examining. "How do you know about the post office?" he said. "Fitch let it slip when he came here asking about your papers," she said. "He used the phrase, 'Nothing moves through this town without our awareness.' It was slightly too confident for a man fishing in the dark." She met his eyes. "He was telling me they had the post office covered. He didn't know I was listening to everything." Benjamin looked at her for a long moment. "Amelia," he said, "I need you to understand something." "You can tell me later," she said. "Go send the telegraph." I went. She turned back to her notebook. Margaret set a fresh cup of coffee at her elbow without being asked. "He's in love with you," Margaret said, with the conversational ease of someone discussing the weather. "Margaret, I'm not asking you to do anything about it. I'm just noting it, for accuracy." "I'm aware," Amelia said. She picked up the coffee. "I'm not in a position to think about that right now." "You're always going to be working on something," Margaret said. "That's who you are." Amelia looked at her. "That's not a criticism," Margaret added. "It's an observation. Just don't let the work become the wall." She went back to her kitchen. Amelia sat with the coffee and the documents and the timeline for a moment, holding Margaret's words somewhere separate from the part of her mind that was already running calculations about 7 days and federal injunctions and the Hargrove family's hearing. Then she set the coffee down and got back to work. The telegraph response from Denver arrived in 36 hours. The railroad's chief land officer, a man named Patterson, who owed Benjamin a significant professional favor from a previous negotiation, agreed to forward the internal route survey documents and the relevant internal correspondence through a courier who would carry them personally and deliver them directly to Federal Marshal Calloway in Denver. Benjamin came back to the boarding house with the message at mid-morning, and the expression on his face told her before he said a word that it wasn't entirely good news. "Patterson will send the documents," he said. "But there's a condition." "What condition?" He wants a representative present at the federal proceeding when the case is heard. Someone who can testify to the chain of custody of the railroad documents. He paused. He wants it to be me, in Denver, in person. Amelia understood immediately. If you're in Denver at the proceeding, you're not here. For 3 days minimum, possibly longer. He looked at her. The Hargrove hearing is in 5 days. 5 days. 3 of which Benjamin would be on a road to Denver. I can handle the Hargrove hearing, Amelia said. Amelia, I can file a motion to continue the proceeding on grounds of newly discovered evidence, she said. If I present it to the judge with the documentation we have, the forged survey, the processing discrepancies, the timeline, he's legally required to grant a continuation while the evidence is reviewed. It buys us time. You're not a lawyer, he said. They'll question your standing to file. Then I'll find a lawyer. She was already thinking. There's a man named Carl Whitfield who handles property disputes out of Pueblo. He represented the Kellerman family before they ran out of money for his fees. He knows this valley and he doesn't like Croft. I heard him say so at the general store 2 weeks ago, which at the time seemed like casual conversation and now seems like Providence. She looked up. Can you send a wire to him before you leave? Benjamin stood still in the middle of the parlor, looking at her. She could see him working through the scenario, the moving pieces, the timelines, the risks. She had the distinct sense that he was also working through something else, something that had nothing to do with timelines. You'd be doing this without me here, he said. I've been doing quite a lot without you here, she said. You were in Denver for 4 days, in case you've forgotten. This is different. Why? Because Croft is scared now, he said, and his voice had gone lower and more careful. And scared men do things that careful men don't. If he finds out you're filing a continuance motion, if he understands that you're the one building this case, he won't send Fitch to ask polite questions. Amelia held his gaze. I know that, she said. Then you know I don't want to leave you here to deal with it alone. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what Margaret had said. She thought about the particular quality of the way he said those words, not possessively, not as a man who thought she needed protecting, but as a man who simply did not want to be somewhere else when the person he cared about was in danger. Those were different things. She knew the difference. Go to Denver, she said. Get Patterson's testimony and Calloway's authorization. I will handle Carl Whitfield and the Hargrove continuance. She paused. And I will be careful. He looked at her for another beat. Then he reached into his coat and produced a small card. He set it on the table between them. Calloway's deputy is a man named Reeves, he said. He's stationed in Pueblo. If anything happens, anything at all, you send word to him directly. He has authorization to act independently if Calloway is unreachable. She picked up the card. All right. Promise me, he said. It was a simple request. 2 words. She'd had men make far more complicated demands on her patience and time, and this was just a man asking her to let someone help her if she needed it. I promise, she said. He left the next morning. She stood on the boarding house porch and watched him ride, and then she went inside and sent a message to Carl Whitfield in Pueblo. Whitfield arrived 2 days later, and his arrival was either perfect timing or the specific mercy of a universe that occasionally decided someone had suffered enough and handed them something useful. He was a compact, precise man in his 50s, with ink stains on his right hand and the particular directness of a lawyer who had stopped caring about decorum sometime in the previous decade. He read the documentation she presented him in 45 minutes without speaking. Then he set it down and said, "Where did you learn to build an evidentiary package like this?" "My mother believed in thorough preparation," Amelia said. "Is it sufficient?" "It's better than sufficient." He tapped the timeline. "This is the kind of thing you usually need 3 months and a team of clerks to produce. How long did it take you?" 4 days. He looked at her. "You built this in 4 days." "I had excellent source material," she said. "Can you file the continuance motion for the Hargrove hearing?" "I can file it tomorrow morning," he said. "And with this documentation, any judge worth his appointment will grant it." He paused. I'd also like to file simultaneous motions to continue the Kellerman and Dunmore proceedings while we're at it. Hit all three at once before Croft understands what's happening. Amelia felt something shift in the math of the situation. The particular sensation of a carefully constructed plan gaining momentum. The point where individual pieces begin moving together with enough force that the outcome becomes, for the first time, genuinely predictable. Yes, she said. Do all three. And on the morning of the 5th day after Benjamin had ridden for Denver, Carl Whitfield walked into the county courthouse and filed 3 simultaneous motions to continue land proceedings on the grounds of newly discovered evidence of fraud. Within the hour, the news reached Elias Croft. And within 2 hours of that, Amelia Whitaker received a message at the boarding house. No signature. 6 words, written in a careful hand on plain paper. She read it once, folded it, placed it in her notebook. Then she sat down, opened the notebook to a clean page, and wrote out every piece of information she had, every name, every date, every document location, in a complete summary that could be understood and acted upon by anyone who read it, with no prior knowledge of what she and Benjamin had built together. She sealed the summary in an envelope. She addressed it to Deputy Reeves in Pueblo. And then she went to find Margaret Ellis, because the 6 words on that note told her that Elias Croft was no longer sending Fitch to ask polite questions. The note had said, "We know what you have. Give it back." Margaret Ellis did not panic. That was the first thing Amelia noticed when she put the note on the kitchen table between them. Margaret read it, set it down, and poured herself a cup of coffee, with the steady hands of a woman who had been in this valley long enough to have seen threats arrive in many forms and understood that the ones delivered in writing were almost always the least dangerous kind. "He's trying to frighten you into giving back the documents," Margaret said. "If he had the power to simply take them, he wouldn't be sending notes." "That's what I thought too," Amelia said. "But the operative word is yet." Margaret looked at her over the rim of her cup. "Croft knows Whitfield filed the continuance motions this morning," Amelia continued. "He knows we've made contact with the federal marshal's office. He knows we have the original documents. And now he knows that burning this down quietly, the way he's been burning everything else, is no longer possible." She paused. "A man who has been careful for 18 months just had careful taken away from him. I don't know what he does next, but I know it won't be another politely worded note." "Then we don't stay here," Margaret said. "I'm not leaving you alone in this house. I'm not asking you to." Margaret set her cup down and stood up with the economical purpose of a woman transitioning from consideration to action. "I'm saying we don't stay here and wait for whatever comes next. Waiting is how you end up with no choices." She looked at Amelia. "The documents under the church floor, are they safe where they are? For now. The copies I have here are the ones that matter for the immediate proceedings. The originals only matter if the copies are challenged. Then the copies come with us. The originals stay where they are." Margaret moved toward the back of the house. "Get your things. We're going to Ruth Dunmore's." Amelia stared at her. "Ruth Dunmore's. The woman is about to lose her land, and she has every reason in the world to help us protect the evidence that saves it." Margaret paused in the doorway. "She also has a husband's hunting rifles, a barn with 3 exits, and a property that Croft cannot legally access without a county writ, which he cannot get before tomorrow morning at the earliest, because the county clerk's office closes in 20 minutes. She tilted her head. "I checked the clock before I poured the coffee." Amelia looked at her for a moment. "How long have you been preparing for something like this?" she said. "Since 1863, Margaret said simply, and disappeared into the back of the house. They were at Ruth Dunmore's before sundown. Ruth opened the door, took one look at both of them, and stood back without a single question, which told Amelia everything she needed to know about the kind of woman Ruth Dunmore was underneath the quiet endurance. "I'll put coffee on," Ruth said. "Send word to the Kellerman family first," Amelia told her, "and the Hargroves. They need to know that the continuance motions were filed, and they need to know why they shouldn't make any agreements with anyone from the county land office until they hear from us." She paused. "Can you get word to them tonight?" "My neighbor boy is 17 and rides like the devil is behind him," Ruth said. I'll have him saddled and out before you've settled in." She was as good as her word. The boy was gone in 10 minutes, and Ruth came back to the kitchen table with the coffee and the particular focused stillness of a woman who has been waiting for something she can actually do and has finally been handed it. "Tell me what you need," Ruth said. So Amelia told her. All of it. Croft, Vane, the railroad corridor, the forged documents, the federal case Benjamin was building in Denver, the continuance motions Whitfield had filed that morning. She told it clean and fast, without softening any of it, because Ruth Dunmore had earned the unvarnished truth, and because Amelia had no patience left for managing how information landed. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Amelia finished, Ruth sat still for a moment, both hands around her coffee cup. "Arthur Vane," she said. "The territorial commissioner." "Yes." "He attended my husband's funeral," Ruth said. "He stood at the graveside and shook my hand and told me what a fine man Daniel was and what a beautiful piece of land we had here." Her voice was completely level. "He said he hoped I could hold on to it." The silence that followed had a specific texture, the kind that happens when something that seemed like casual cruelty resolves into something more deliberate and more calculated. Amelia watched Ruth's face and saw the moment it moved from grief to something harder. "I was already planning it," Ruth said. "At the funeral. He already knew what he was going to do." "I believe so," Amelia said. Ruth set her cup down with a precision that suggested she was being very deliberate about not throwing it. "All right," she said. "What do we do?" They spent the night at Ruth's, and it was the most productive night Amelia had spent since the whole investigation began, not because of any dramatic development, but because Ruth Dunmore knew things about the valley and its people and its history that 3 weeks in Margaret Ellis's ledgers hadn't fully captured. She knew which families were affected and hadn't yet been contacted. She knew which county officials were Croft's people and which ones had been quietly unhappy about his influence for years. She knew the judge-assigned context and would be furious to learn it. "Judge Harlan," Ruth said. "He ruled against the Hargroves because the documents showed clear deed irregularities. He had no reason to believe they were forged." She looked at Amelia. "But if he understood what he was actually looking at, the man has a temper for injustice that I have witnessed personally on 2 occasions, and on both occasions it benefited the person who'd been wronged." "Can Whitfield get in front of him today?" Amelia said. "Before the court opens?" "Harlan takes breakfast at the hotel on Tuesdays," Ruth said. "Always has. He arrives at 7:30, and he is available to anyone who needs him for the 30 minutes before the dining room fills up, because he believes that accessibility is a requirement of the position." She paused. "It is currently Monday night." Amelia looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Amelia. Something passed between them. The wordless communication of 2 women who have been working toward the same thing long enough to stop needing to speak every thought out loud. "I need to get a message to Whitfield tonight," Amelia said. "He needs to be at that hotel at 7:30 tomorrow morning with the documentation." "The same neighbor boy can do it," Ruth said. "He's been back for an hour." The message went out. Amelia sat at Ruth's kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning, writing the briefing she wanted Whitfield to present to Judge Harlan. Not a legal filing, not a formal proceeding, just a clear and organized account of what the judge had been given versus what the evidence actually showed, written for a man of intelligence and integrity who had been deceived and needed enough information to understand the full shape of the deception before he walked into his own courtroom. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, from the ground up, with the internal logic made explicit, with every claim supported by a specific document reference. She wrote it as if the judge had never heard of Elias Croft, because she had learned that assuming prior knowledge was the fastest way to lose an argument. When she finished, she read it through twice, changed 4 sentences, and handed it to Ruth. "Does this read clearly to you?" she said. "You're not a lawyer, and you haven't been inside the evidence the way I have. If there's anything that doesn't land, I need to know." Ruth read it carefully. She asked 2 clarifying questions, both sharp, both things Amelia amended immediately. Then she looked up. "If I were that judge," Ruth said, "I would be absolutely furious." "Good," Amelia said. "That's exactly right." She slept for 4 hours. It was enough. Whitfield was at the hotel at 7:15. He sent a message back to Ruth's at 9:30, 3 lines, that said, Harlan read everything. He called Croft's court clerk into his chambers at 8 o'clock. The hearing is postponed indefinitely pending review. He is requesting the county land records going back 3 years. Ruth read the message at the kitchen table and covered her mouth with both hands. Margaret said, "There it is." Amelia sat very still and let herself feel it for exactly 1 moment. The relief, the particular kind of satisfaction that comes when something you built with your hands and your whole attention does exactly what you constructed it to do. She let herself feel it, acknowledged it, and then put it aside, because indefinitely pending review was not the same as resolved, and 3 years of county land records was going to reveal a great deal more than anyone had currently accounted for. The message from Deputy Reeves arrived at noon. It had been forwarded from the boarding house, Margaret's arrangement, a signal she'd set up with the woman who ran the post counter, and it was longer than Amelia expected. Reeves had received her summary. He had also, it turned out, received word from Federal Marshal Calloway in Denver, transmitted that morning. Benjamin had reached Denver. Patterson's railroad documents were in Calloway's hands. Calloway had reviewed the complete evidentiary package, the original documentation Amelia had built, the railroad route correlation, Patterson's testimony about the internal survey knowledge, and had issued emergency federal injunctions on all 3 land proceedings. All 3. Ruth Dunmore's land was safe. The Kellerman claim was protected. The Hargrove proceeding was frozen. Additionally, Calloway had issued a federal warrant for the arrest of Harold Fitch on charges of document fraud in connection with federal land proceedings. He had issued a material witness summons for Elias Croft, pending further investigation, and he had formally opened an inquiry into Arthur Vane's activities as Territorial Land Commissioner, with a request to the Territorial Governor's Office for immediate suspension of Vane's land review authority pending the outcome. Amelia read the message twice. Then she handed it to Margaret. Margaret read it, handed it to Ruth. Ruth read it and sat down on the kitchen floor, which was not something Amelia had been expecting, but which she understood completely. Sometimes the end of a long fight arrives so suddenly that your legs simply don't have the organizational capacity to process it upright. She sat down beside Ruth on the floor. Margaret stood over them both with her coffee cup and said, "Get up when you're ready. I'll make more coffee." Ruth laughed. It came out slightly broken and entirely genuine. The laugh of a woman who has been holding something unbearable for long enough that release feels like a kind of violent grace. "Daniel would have liked you," Ruth told Amelia. "Both of you. I'm sure we'd have liked him," Amelia said. She let herself sit on Ruth Dunmore's kitchen floor for exactly the time it took Ruth to be ready to stand up. Then she stood, smoothed her skirt, and said, "I need to get back to Red Hollow. Benjamin is going to ride back from Denver the moment Calloway releases him, and I need to be there." "Croft," Margaret said quietly from the doorway. "Reeves has a warrant for Fitch, a summons for Croft, but a summons isn't an arrest." Amelia had not forgotten this. She had been sitting with it quietly while everything else resolved, the way you keep an eye on the one piece of the situation that hasn't settled. "Croft is going to know by this afternoon that Fitch has been arrested and that there's a federal warrant with his name on it," she said. "His choices at that point are to run or to fight." "Which does he do?" Ruth asked. "I don't know him well enough to predict that," Amelia said. "But I know which one is more dangerous for us if he chooses it." She was back at the boarding house by early afternoon. It looked undisturbed. The same worn boards, the same blue curtains in the front window, the particular stillness of a house that has been waiting patiently. She went in, checked every room out of a habit she'd developed recently, and found nothing wrong. She was in the kitchen with the documentation spread out when the knock came at the back door. She didn't move for a moment. The back door. The knock was 3 measured beats. Not urgent, not casual. The knock of a man who wanted to be heard without being announced. She picked up the small revolver that Margaret had given her 2 days ago, held it out of sight at her side, and opened the door. Harold Fitch stood on the back step. He looked considerably worse than the last time she'd seen him. The careful, unremarkable presentation was gone. replaced by the specific disorder of a man who had been moving fast since early morning and hadn't stopped to think about what he looked like. His hat was askew. There was mud on his coat. Most significantly, there were no documents in his hands, no official bearing, no manufactured authority. Just a frightened man who had run out of options and apparently, somehow, ended up at her door. "Miss Whitaker," he said. His voice was lower and more raw than she'd heard it. "I need to talk to you." She looked at him steadily. "You have 30 seconds to give me a reason not to close this door." "I'll testify," he said. "Against Croft, against Vane. Everything. The full operation, the names, the process, who paid whom and when and how much." His jaw worked. "I need protection. Croft's going to know by tonight that the federal warrant has my name on it, and if he runs, he's going to make sure I can't testify to anything before he does." Amelia looked at him. She was aware, in a very precise way, of the weight of the revolver in her right hand. She was also aware that what Harold Fitch was offering, full cooperation testimony, the names and the money trail, was exactly the piece of the federal case that could move it from significant to airtight. "You come inside," she said. "You sit down at that table. You don't touch anything, and you don't move from that chair without my permission. And you start talking." He came in. He sat down. And then Harold Fitch, Deputy Land Registrar, and the man whose processing stamp had appeared on every fraudulent document in Six Families' Nightmares, started talking. He talked for 2 hours. Amelia wrote everything down. The scope of what he described was larger than even the federal inquiry had mapped. Vane had been running land acquisition schemes in 3 territories, not 1. The Colorado operation was the most sophisticated because the railroad route gave it the highest eventual return. But there were parallel schemes in New Mexico Territory and in Kansas, using local officials who'd been quietly recruited over the previous 3 years through a combination of financial incentive and careful blackmail. Croft had been Vane's primary legal architect, the man who understood how to construct forgeries that would survive casual scrutiny and which judges and clerks in which counties were susceptible to which pressures. Fitch had been a convenience, a capable administrator who had made one desperate financial decision 5 years ago and had been owned by Croft ever since. "He never let me forget it," Fitch said. "Every time I thought about going to someone, every time, he reminded me exactly what he knew and exactly what it would cost me." He looked at his hands on the table. "I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me. I know what I did. I just need you to understand that I've been waiting for someone to build something solid enough that going against him wouldn't be suicide." "And now you think that's what we have," Amelia said. 3 simultaneous federal injunctions and a Callaway investigation, Fitch said. "That's not someone fishing. That's someone who's already got the net in the water." He looked at her. "Is Hartwell behind this?" "Hartwell is in Denver right now getting Callaway's authorization," she said. "He'll be back by tomorrow." "Croft thinks Hartwell is the center of it," Fitch said. "He doesn't know about you." Amelia paused in her writing. "What do you mean?" "I mean Croft knows Hartwell has been investigating. He knows about the federal contact. He does not know." Fitch looked at her carefully. "That you're the one who built the case. He thinks you're here because Hartwell needed somewhere to work. He thinks you're—" He stopped. "He thinks I'm what?" she said. Fitch had the decency to look uncomfortable. "He thinks you're Hartwell's woman. Involved personally, not professionally. He discounted you." The specific quality of that sentence landed in a place she recognized. The old familiar territory of being looked past, assessed as adjacent rather than central, filed under someone else's name rather than her own. She had lived there for 31 years. She knew every corner of it. And for one sharp, clarifying moment, she understood that Croft's miscalculation was not her problem. It was her advantage. "All right," she said. She kept writing. "What does Croft know about the document's location?" "He knows they're not at the boarding house anymore. Fitch had someone check while Margaret and I were at Ruth's, but we'd already moved them." Fitch hesitated. "He also knows the church. I'm sorry. He has a man who watches and reports." Amelia put her pen down. "He knows about the church floor. He's going to move tonight," Fitch said. "If he doesn't run first, He either gets those documents back or he destroys them. He paused. Without the originals, your copies can be challenged as fabrications. The case gets complicated. She stood up. Stay here, she told Fitch. Do not leave this kitchen. She went to find Margaret, who was, as always when something required clear thinking, at the kitchen stove. The originals, Amelia said. We need to move them again. Where? Not the church, not here, not Ruth's. She thought hard, went through every option she had and stripped out the ones that had any connection to her, to Margaret, to Benjamin, to anyone Croft had been watching. Whitfield, she said. His office is in Pueblo. He came here, but his office is 40 miles away. It's an independent legal office with privilege protections, and Croft has no established surveillance there because he never needed it. Whitfield was never part of this until 2 days ago. Margaret was already untying her apron. I'll get the church key. I'll write Whitfield a letter. The neighbor boy. Still here, Margaret said. He's been sleeping in the barn since yesterday. I've been feeding him. Of course she had. The documents were moved within the hour. The neighbor boy, whose name was Thomas, which Amelia realized she should have learned days ago and felt genuinely ashamed about, rode for Pueblo with a sealed letter to Whitfield and the originals wrapped in oilcloth in his saddlebag. Amelia watched him go, and then she stood on the boarding house porch and thought about Elias Croft, who was going to discover tonight that the documents he'd planned to retrieve were gone again. She thought about a frightened man with his back against a wall and the full weight of a federal investigation bearing down on him. She thought about which way that broke. She went back inside. Fitch was exactly where she'd left him. Croft, she said. When he's cornered, does he run or does he stand? Fitch thought about it. Really thought, not the automatic response. He ran once before, he said finally. 12 years ago. There was a situation in Missouri, a business arrangement that went wrong and would have cost him his law license. He left the state overnight and rebuilt somewhere new. He paused. But that was before he had this much to lose. Before Vane. Before the railroad money. He's got more invested now. So you don't know, Amelia said. I don't know, Fitch admitted. She sat down across from him. What would make him stand? What would make him think he could still fight his way out of this? Fitch was quiet, and then he looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has just realized what he knows and is deciding whether to say it. The witness, he said. What witness? The federal case, if it goes to trial, turns on the integrity of the evidence and on witness testimony. Calloway has the documents. He has my cooperation. He met her eyes. But the most compelling witness, the one who can testify to the full chain of evidence and who built the case from the original documentation, is you. Amelia said nothing. If Croft believed that removing you from the equation, discrediting you, frightening you into disappearing, making you unavailable or unreliable as a witness, would create enough uncertainty in the federal case to buy him time or an acquittal. Fitch stopped. Then he stands, Amelia said. And he comes for me. Yes, Fitch said. They looked at each other across the table. When does Benjamin get back from Denver? Fitch said. Tomorrow, she said, if he rides through the night. Fitch said nothing. He didn't have to. She could do the math herself. She thought about writing to Deputy Reeves. She thought about the card Benjamin had left, the promise she'd made. She got halfway to the writing desk before something stopped her. Not pride, not stubbornness, but a clear and practical assessment of time and distance. Reeves was in Pueblo, 40 miles. By the time a message reached him and he could respond, it would be tomorrow regardless. She had tonight. She thought about Croft. She thought about what she knew about him, which was considerable, assembled over weeks of reading his methodology and the documents he'd created. He was meticulous. He was calculating. He was not, fundamentally, a man of violence. He used legal architecture the way some men used fists, which was both his strength and, potentially, his limitation. He'll send someone, she said. Not to Fitch. Just working through it out loud. He won't come himself, Fitch agreed, which means whoever comes will have instructions and a purpose, but limited authority to improvise. She turned that over. Legal pressure or intimidation. He'll try to buy me off or frighten me off before he tries anything else. And if neither works? Then we find out what kind of man he actually is when the legal architecture is gone, she said. But I think we try to get there without finding out. She walked back to the desk and wrote 3 letters. One to Reeves, the promise she'd made Benjamin, kept regardless of whether it solved anything in time. One to Whitfield in Pueblo, adding a postscript to the message Thomas carried, asking him to formally designate Amelia Whitaker as a material witness in the federal case, which created a legal protection she didn't currently have. And one to Benjamin, which she didn't know how to reach except by hope. She addressed it to Calloway's Denver office and trusted that a man who had been writing toward her would eventually find his way to a letter addressed to him. She didn't write much. She had never been a woman who used excess words. She wrote, "The case is solid. Fitch is cooperating. The originals are safe. Come back when you can and not before. I am managing." She sealed it. She said it with the others. And then she heard the boots on the front porch. Not a knock this time. Just the weight of someone stopping on the boards, deliberate, in no hurry. Margaret came out of the kitchen doorway. Amelia met her eyes. Margaret reached into the pocket of her apron and produced the Colt revolver with the absolute calm of a woman who had mentioned it was there and saw no reason for further commentary. Amelia had her own. She crossed to the door and stood beside it. Not in front of it, beside it, which was a piece of practical knowledge she'd absorbed somewhere in the last several weeks without quite knowing when. Miss Whitaker. The voice from the other side of the door was smooth, carefully modulated. A man who had been educated in how to sound reasonable. My name is Charles Devereaux. I'm an attorney representing certain interests that I believe you're familiar with. I'd very much like to speak with you. Amelia said nothing for a moment. Certain interests, she repeated, at normal volume, through the door. Mr. Croft would like to propose a resolution, Devereaux said. He believes that there has been a significant misunderstanding regarding the county land proceedings, and he is prepared to make a generous offer to all parties involved in exchange for the documents, Amelia said. A brief pause. In exchange for a cessation of the current federal inquiry. Mr. Croft is prepared to make full restitution to the affected families, to resign his position, and to... The federal inquiry is not mine to stop, Amelia said. It belongs to U.S. Marshal Calloway. You'll need to take your proposal to Denver. Miss Whitaker. The smooth voice took on a slightly harder edge. I think we both know that the Marshal's inquiry depends substantially on the evidentiary package that you assembled. And I think we both know that the integrity of that package depends on its chain of custody, which is, currently, less documented than one might prefer. A pause. Mr. Croft is a patient man. He is also a thorough one. We have time. Amelia looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Amelia. We have time. There it was. The implicit threat dressed in legal language. Not tonight, not overtly, but a clock beginning. The suggestion that the situation remained fluid, that the documents could be challenged, that witnesses could be made unavailable, that patience was a weapon available to a man who had successfully operated in the margins for 18 months. Tell Mr. Croft, Amelia said, that the documents he's referring to are no longer in this county. They are in the custody of attorney Carl Whitfield in Pueblo, who has formally logged them as evidence in a federal proceeding and who is, as of this morning, retained as material witness counsel. She paused. Tell him also that I have been formally designated as a material witness by Whitfield's office, which means that any interference with my cooperation constitutes a separate federal felony. Another pause. And tell him that Harold Fitch is sitting at my kitchen table. The silence on the other side of the door lasted a long time. When Devereaux spoke again, the smooth had gone out of his voice entirely. What was left was something considerably more raw and considerably less polished. I'll relay the message, he said. She heard him leave, heard the footsteps cross the porch and go down the steps and continue down the street until they were gone. Margaret lowered the Colt. Amelia kept hers, where it was a moment longer, listening to the empty porch and the ordinary sounds of Red Hollow settling into its nighttime rhythms. Then she put the revolver in her apron pocket and went back to the kitchen, where Harold Fitch was sitting exactly where she'd left him. He looked at her face and knew. "Devereaux," he said. "Croft's outside lawyer. He came with an offer." She sat down. "I declined. He'll report back tonight." Fitch rubbed his face. "Croft will know by morning that you have me, that the documents are in Pueblo, and that the material witness designation is filed." He looked at his hands. "That's almost everything he has left in play. Gone." "Almost," Amelia said. "He still has Vane," Fitch said quietly. "Vane has connections that go above Calloway. If he can make the right contact in Washington before the inquiry advances—" "Calloway anticipated that," Amelia said. "He didn't tell Benjamin directly, but the way he structured the inquiry, filing simultaneously in Denver and in the territorial capital and with the federal land office in Washington, means Vane can't quietly redirect it. There's no single point to intercept." Fitch looked at her. "You worked that out yourself." "I had a good look at how Calloway operates," she said. "A careful man who knows his opposition, is politically connected, doesn't build a case with one path to resolution. He builds it with three." Fitch was quiet for a moment. "You're remarkable," he said. "I don't say that to flatter you. I say it because I've been inside Croft's operation for 5 years, and I've watched him dismantle people with considerably more resources than you had 6 weeks ago." "I didn't have resources," Amelia agreed. "I had information and time and people who were willing to trust me." "That's usually enough," Fitch said. "For the right person." She didn't answer that. She picked up her pen and went back to writing. At 2 in the morning, when the boarding house was dark, and Margaret had finally gone to bed, and Fitch was asleep on the parlor floor with a blanket Ruth had sent, Amelia sat alone at the kitchen table with her notebook open, and the lamp turned low, and the particular quiet of a night that has passed through its most dangerous hours without catastrophe. She thought about what Fitch had said, about Croft not knowing she was the center of it, about the 31 years of being overlooked, assessed as adjacent, filed under someone else's importance. She thought about the look on Benjamin Hartwell's face across Margaret's dining table 3 weeks ago, when she'd named the discrepancy in the seal date before he'd thought to ask. She thought about her mother, who had believed that a person with enough time and a good enough library could understand anything, who had said, in the last weeks of her life, that the world did not always reward what it should, but that the work itself was worth doing regardless. She thought about Ruth Dunmore's land, which was safe tonight. About the Kellerman family and the Hargroves, who would wake up tomorrow with federal injunctions protecting what they'd built. About Thomas, the neighbor boy, riding through the night with oilcloth-wrapped documents in his saddlebag, doing something genuinely important without knowing the full shape of what he was carrying. She thought about all of it, and then she closed her notebook and put out the lamp and went to her narrow bed above the kitchen. She was asleep within minutes. She had learned, somewhere in the last 6 weeks, to sleep when sleep was available, because the work had a way of not waiting. Benjamin Hartwell rode into Red Hollow at 9:30 the following morning, which was not tomorrow as she'd told Devereaux, but the same night, because he had ridden straight through without stopping. He looked like a man who had pushed both himself and his horse to the edge of their respective limits, and arrived at a conclusion he'd been working toward for the entire 40 miles. She was on the porch when he came up the street, and she knew from the way he was riding that something had shifted, not in the case, but in him. The particular quality of a man who has spent time on a dark road working through something and arrived at the other end of it. He dismounted. He tied the horse. He came up the porch steps and stopped in front of her and looked at her with the direct gray gaze she'd first seen coming up through pain and shock in a Colorado ditch, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "I got your letter," he said finally. "The one at Calloway's office." "Good," she said. "Then you know the case is solid." "I know the case is solid." He didn't look away from her. "That's not why I rode through the night." She looked at him steadily. "I rode through the night," he said, with the particular careful honesty of a man who has rehearsed this on horseback and is now committed to it regardless of how it lands, "because I left you here alone with Croft circling, and I spent 40 miles understanding that was the wrong decision and that I was not going to spend another night making it." Amelia looked at him. She looked at his tired face and his dusty coat, and the absolute sincerity of a man who had stopped calculating and was simply saying the true thing. She thought about what Margaret had told her, about work becoming a wall. "Devereaux came last night," she said. "I know." Calloway's deputy wired ahead. He paused. "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly all right." She paused. "You look terrible." "I've been on a horse for 9 hours. Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He followed her inside. He sat down at the kitchen table where she had spent more of the last 3 weeks than she could count. And she put the coffee on, and she told him everything that had happened. Fitch's arrival, Devereaux's offer, the documents in Pueblo, the material witness designation. Clean and clear and in the right order. The way she told everything. He listened the way he always listened to her. Completely, without interrupting, with the full attention of a man who understood that she was not summarizing for his benefit, but giving him the information they would need to work with going forward. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You handled all of that," he said. "I told you I would. You did." He looked at her across the table. "I'm starting to understand that when you tell me you'll handle something, the appropriate response is to believe you." "It would save us both some time," she agreed. Something shifted in his expression. That particular quality she'd been not examining for 3 weeks, closer to the surface now, less controlled. "Amelia," he said. "Benjamin," she said. "I need to say something that has nothing to do with Croft or Vane or the federal case." "I know," she said. "You know what I'm going to say?" "I have a fairly good idea." She picked up her coffee cup. "But you should say it anyway. Some things need to be said out loud." He looked at her. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window, and he was tired and dusty from 40 miles of dark road, and he said it anyway, exactly the way she'd known he would, directly, without ornament, with the particular honesty of a man who had decided that the careful approach had run its course. And when he finished, Amelia Whittaker set down her coffee cup, looked at Benjamin Hartwell across the table where they had spent 3 weeks building something together, and said, "I'm not going to fall in love with your 12,000 acres." "I know," he said. "Or your bank account." "I know. I'm going to fall in love with the man who came back to find me," she said. "Who valued my work before he valued anything else. Who didn't ask me to be smaller so he could feel bigger." She held his gaze. "That man I could fall in love with." Benjamin looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a man who has been given something he'd stopped allowing himself to expect. "I reckon that's who I'm trying to be," he said quietly. "Good," she said. "Keep trying. I'll let you know how it's going." And then, because the coffee was still hot and the day had real work left in it, she picked up her notebook, opened it to the next clean page, and said, "Now, tell me what Calloway said about the timeline for Vane's arrest." Calloway's timeline for Vane was 14 days. Benjamin laid it out at the kitchen table with the documents Calloway had sent back with him, a formal federal inquiry schedule, a list of witnesses being summoned, a preliminary injunction on Vane's Land Review Authority that had already been transmitted to the Territorial Governor's Office in Denver. 14 days from the filing of the emergency injunctions to a formal federal hearing at which Arthur Vane would be required to appear and answer for his conduct as Territorial Land Commissioner. 14 days was also, Amelia noted immediately, enough time for a man with Washington connections and the motivation of self-preservation to make things significantly more complicated. "Calloway knows that," Benjamin said, when she said so. "What's his counter? He's moved faster than the timeline suggests. The preliminary injunction on Vane's authority went out yesterday morning, before Vane would have known the full scope of what Calloway had." He tapped the document. "And he's filed the witness summons through the federal court rather than the territorial court, which means Vane can't intercept them at the territorial level." "Fitch," Amelia said. "We need to get Fitch to Denver to give his formal statement before the 14 days are up. If Vane's people get to him—" "Reeves is sending 2 deputies to escort Fitch to Denver," Benjamin said. "They'll be here tomorrow." "Good." She turned another page. "The county land records that Judge Harlan requested. Croft has access to those records." "Had access," Benjamin said. "Harlan suspended Croft's county authorization this morning. He can't touch those records now without committing an additional federal offense. Amelia looked up. Harlan moved on his own? Apparently what Whitfield showed him at breakfast was sufficient motivation. The corner of Benjamin's mouth moved. The phrase Whitfield used in his message was, Judge Harlan was not pleased to discover the extent to which he had been made a party to fraud. I imagine not, she said. They worked through the morning, the two of them at the kitchen table in the way they'd been working for 3 weeks. Passing documents back and forth, building the argument, layer by layer, identifying the gaps and closing them. Margaret brought food at regular intervals and made no comment on the comfortable efficiency with which they operated, though once, refilling the coffee, she caught Amelia's eye with an expression that communicated a considerable amount without a single word. By noon, they had a complete picture of what the federal hearing would need. By early afternoon, Amelia had organized the evidentiary package into the sequence that would build the most compelling case for a federal judge, not just evidence of what had been done, but evidence of the methodology, the scale, and the deliberate coordination that elevated individual instances of document fraud into a conspiracy against federal land interests. She was adding the final section when Benjamin said her name in a tone that made her look up. I was looking at the window, at something in the street. She set down her pen. Elias Croft was standing in the middle of the street outside the boarding house. He was alone. He was not carrying anything. He was dressed the way a man dresses when he has decided to do something he knows will cost him everything and has made peace with that calculation. His best coat, his hat straight, his bearing composed in the particular way that takes real effort to maintain when everything is collapsing. He was looking directly at the window. Benjamin stood up. Stay here, he said. Absolutely not, Amelia said, and was on her feet before he'd finished the sentence. He looked at her. She looked at him. He accepted, with the particular grace of a man who had learned when an argument was over before it began, that they were going out together. Croft watched them come down the porch steps without moving. Up close, he looked worse than his careful presentation suggested. The sleepless quality around his eyes, the tension in his jaw that no amount of composure could entirely conceal. He was a man who had built something meticulously for 18 months and had watched it dismantle itself in 4 days, and the weight of that was visible regardless of how straight he held himself. Mr. Hartwell, he said. Then his eyes moved to Amelia. Miss Whitaker. Croft, Benjamin said. A silence settled. It was the kind of silence that happens when people who have been in opposition reach the moment where the opposition is effectively over and everyone present knows it, and the only remaining question is what form the ending takes. I've had communication from Devereaux, Croft said. About last night. I assumed as much, Amelia said. You have Fitch. It wasn't a question. I have Fitch. Croft was quiet for a moment. Fitch knows everything, he said. There's very little he couldn't tell a federal court. I know, Amelia said. He told me. Something moved across Croft's face, not anger, not desperation. Something that looked, surprisingly, like a kind of exhausted acknowledgement. The expression of a man who has run a complicated game and has just encountered the specific move that makes the game unwinnable. I need to understand something, he said. He looked at Amelia directly, and the quality of his attention was different now. Stripped of the dismissiveness she'd heard in Devereaux's voice, stripped of the comfortable assumption that she was adjacent rather than central. He had worked out by now, clearly, that the assumption had been catastrophically wrong. When did you start building the case? Before Hartwell went to Denver or after? Before, she said. The first time I sent Fitch to the boarding house. I already had the timeline, she said. The seal date discrepancy, the surveyor signatures, the processing schedule. I had it before Fitch knocked on that door. Croft absorbed that. And the railroad connection. That took another 2 days. He looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of a man revising a fundamental miscalculation. I underestimated you, he said. Yes, Amelia said. You did. I underestimated. He stopped. Started again, with something in his voice that was not quite an apology, but was as close as a man like Croft was likely to get. I made the assumption that this was Hartwell's operation. I directed everything toward disrupting his investigation. I didn't. He exhaled. I didn't see you. Most people don't, Amelia said. I've had some time to get used to it. Another silence. Benjamin stood slightly to her left, present and steady, saying nothing because this was not his conversation to steer. I'm not going to run, Croft said. I want you to know that. Devereaux suggested it. I considered it for approximately 6 hours last night. He straightened his coat with a gesture that seemed almost automatic. I'm not going to make this harder for those families than it needs to be. They've had enough. Amelia studied him. You're going to cooperate. I'm going to engage a lawyer and cooperate with the federal inquiry, yes. His voice was flat, but not broken. I'll save Calloway some time, and I'll give him what he needs on Vane. Vane is already facing a federal inquiry, Benjamin said. What Calloway has on Vane from me will be considerably more specific than what he currently has, Croft said. There are documents, communications between us that I retained as a form of insurance. I'm not proud of the reason I kept them. He paused. But they'll be useful now. Amelia looked at Benjamin. Benjamin looked at Amelia. Give them to Calloway directly, Amelia said. Not to Devereaux, not through any county channel. Directly to Calloway's deputy Reeves in Pueblo, who can transmit them securely. Croft nodded once. All right. He looked at her one more time. Not the calculating assessment of a man sizing up an obstacle, but something more honest and considerably more complicated. Then he turned and walked back up the street, and the three of them, Amelia, Benjamin, Margaret standing on the porch behind them, Colt somewhere about her person, watched him go. Well, Margaret said from the porch, that was not how I expected that to end. He's not a good man, Benjamin said quietly, but he's a man who knows when it's over. Sometimes that's enough, Amelia said. She watched Croft's retreating figure and felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite satisfaction, a kind of quiet completion, the sensation of a piece finding its place in a structure she'd been building by hand for weeks. She held it for a moment, acknowledged it, and then let it pass, because there was still work to be done, and she was, fundamentally, a woman who preferred the doing to the dwelling. The 2 weeks that followed moved with the particular controlled urgency of something that has been set in motion and cannot be stopped, but requires constant management to arrive at the right destination. Fitch went to Denver with Reeves's deputies and gave his formal statement over 2 days, producing a record of the scheme's operation, so detailed and so specific that Calloway described it later as the most comprehensive cooperative testimony he had received in 14 years of federal service. Croft's documents arrived at Reeves's office the day after the boarding house conversation, sealed and logged and formally transmitted to Denver before noon. Communications between Croft and Vane going back 16 months that laid out the railroad land scheme in language so explicit it eliminated any remaining uncertainty about Vane's role as architect and primary beneficiary. Arthur Vane received his federal summons on a Tuesday morning in Denver, delivered by 2 U.S. Marshals to his office in the Territorial Land Commissioner's Building. The account of what happened in the first 30 seconds after he read it was relayed to Amelia through Calloway's deputy, with the particular relish of a man who rarely got to deliver news this satisfying. Vane had attempted to telephone the governor's office, had been informed by Calloway's deputy present in the room that the governor had already been briefed and that the call would not be productive, and had then sat down heavily in his chair and not moved for the better part of 5 minutes. He retained 4 lawyers. It didn't change the trajectory. The federal hearing was held in Denver on the 14th day, as scheduled, in a courtroom that was fuller than federal land proceedings usually warranted because word had traveled the way. Word does in territories where everyone's land is their livelihood, and the people who threaten it are the people everyone has reason to fear. Amelia testified for 2 hours. She presented the evidentiary package she had assembled, the timeline, the document analysis, the geographic alignment of the fraudulent land transfers with the railroad route, the chain of evidence from the first forged seal to the last manipulated hearing date. And she presented it with the same quality she brought to everything. Clean, precise, completely organized, leaving no gap a defense attorney could step into and call uncertain. The federal judge, a small, sharp-eyed man from Washington named Holt, who had the efficient patience of someone who had seen a great many things and was not easily impressed, asked her 3 questions during her testimony. Each one was designed to test the integrity of a specific link in the evidentiary chain. She answered all 3 without hesitating, with specific document references, and Judge Holt wrote something in his notes after each answer, with the kind of brief, satisfied motion a man makes when he's heard what he needed to hear. Arthur Vane sat at the defense table and watched her testify with the expression of a man who is watching his most fundamental miscalculation play itself out in real time and cannot stop it. When she stepped down from the witness stand, she did not look at Vane. She had nothing left to say to him, and she had learned that some acknowledgments were worth less than the air required to make them. Benjamin was waiting for her in the hallway outside the courtroom. He had testified earlier. Patterson's railroad documents, his own account of the initial attack and the investigation, the full trajectory of what he'd discovered before that night on Caldwell's Road. He'd been clean and direct, as she'd expected, and Holt had thanked him with the same brief efficiency he applied to everything. "How did it go?" Benjamin said. "Fine," she said. "It went fine." He looked at her with the particular attention she'd come to understand meant he was reading something in her face that she hadn't put into words. "You're relieved," he said. "I'm satisfied," she said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" She thought about it. They walked down the federal courthouse corridor together, her footsteps and his, the building echoing around them with the particular institutional quiet of a place that has housed a lot of significant moments without comment. "Relief is about what stops," she said. "Satisfaction is about what holds." He looked at her. "The families keep their land," she said. "Vane goes to prison. Croft loses his license and answers for what he did. The records are corrected. Fitch gets a reduced sentence for cooperation and lives with what he chose." She paused. "All of that is going to hold. The work holds. That's satisfaction." Benjamin was quiet for a moment. Then, "And us?" She looked at him sideways. It had become a habit, that particular sideways look that contained more than she usually allowed herself to say directly, and that he had learned, she knew, to read with considerable accuracy. "Ask me properly," she said. "I'm asking you to build something with me," he said. They had reached the courthouse doors, and he stopped before pushing them open, turning to face her in the particular plain way he had when he was saying the true thing and not planning to dress it up. "Not to come work for me, not to manage my land records or my community projects, though God knows you could do both better than anyone I have. I'm asking you to be my partner, in everything, on your terms, with your name on whatever we build, not behind me, beside me." Amelia looked at him. She thought about a road in Colorado 3 years into someone else's life, and a bleeding man in the ditch, and the choice her mother had made her into the kind of person who couldn't walk past it. She thought about $4.11 and a torn coat, and the absolute necessity of figuring out what came next. She thought about Ruth Dunmore's hands on her kitchen table, and Margaret Ellis's colt, and a 17-year-old boy named Thomas, riding through the night with oilcloth-wrapped evidence in his saddlebag. She thought about all the things she'd built from nothing, and what it might be to build something with someone who understood what she was doing while she was doing it. "You understand," she said, "that I will always have opinions." "I'm counting on it," he said, "and that I won't always agree with you." "I'd be worried if you did." "And that the 12,000 acres and the bank account are irrelevant," he said. "I know." She looked at him one more moment. Then she said, "All right." He pushed open the courthouse door, and the Colorado afternoon came in, wide and bright, and carrying the particular clarity of high-altitude air after a clear night, and they walked out into it together. The hearing concluded 3 days later with findings that Judge Holt delivered in language so direct that the court reporter had to ask him to slow down twice. Arthur Vane was convicted on 7 federal counts, including conspiracy to commit land fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, and misuse of federal authority for private financial gain. The sentence was 12 years in a federal penitentiary and permanent disbarment from any position of public trust. Elias Croft received a 2-year sentence, reduced from 7 for full cooperation, and was permanently disbarred from legal practice in the territory. Harold Fitch received 18 months and a fine, with the reduction reflecting both his cooperation and the documented coercion that had kept him inside the scheme long past the point he'd wanted out. Every one of the fraudulent land transfers was voided by federal order. The county land records were corrected. Each affected family received formal written confirmation from the federal court that their deeds were valid, their boundaries were accurate, and their land was theirs without encumbrance. Ruth Dunmore received her confirmation letter on a Thursday, the same day she brought eggs to the boarding house. She arrived with the letter already opened. She'd read it twice on the walk over, she said, to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. And she set the eggs on Margaret's kitchen counter, and sat down at the table, and cried with the uncomplicated completeness of a woman who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and has finally, definitively, been told she can put it down. Margaret made coffee. Amelia sat beside her and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Some moments required only presence, and she had learned enough by now to know which ones those were. When Ruth had finished, she wiped her face with her apron, straightened up, and said, "Daniel would have been furious that it took this long." "He would have been right," Margaret said. "He would have," Ruth agreed. She picked up her coffee. "But it's done now. That's what matters." She looked at Amelia. "That's what you did. You should know that. You should let yourself know it completely." Amelia looked at her. "I'll work on that," she said. Ruth nodded, satisfied, and drank her coffee. Thomas, the neighbor boy, whose full name was Thomas Garvey, and who had shown up at the boarding house 3 days after the Denver hearing to inquire whether any further midnight document delivery was required, with a directness that made both Margaret and Amelia immediately like him considerably more than they already did, was subsequently engaged by Carl Whitfield as a clerk in the Pueblo office at a wage considerably better than anything Red Hollow could offer a 17-year-old with good judgment and excellent horsemanship. Margaret took the credit for recommending him, which was both accurate and entirely in character. Carl Whitfield returned to Pueblo with a professional reputation, enhanced to a degree that kept him busy for the next 3 years. He sent Amelia a formal letter of thanks that was 3 pages long and extremely precise in its acknowledgement of exactly what she had contributed to the federal case, which she kept because it was the first time in her life she had received documentation of her own competence from someone with the professional standing to certify it. She kept it in the box with her mother's letters. She and Benjamin returned to Red Hollow from Denver by the longer route, stopping at each of the affected ranches to deliver the federal court confirmations personally, rather than by post. It took 4 days longer than necessary, and was entirely Benjamin's idea, which told her something about him she already knew, but was glad to see confirmed in practice, rather than just in principle. At each stop, the conversation was different. The Kellerman family's eldest son shook Benjamin's hand and nodded at Amelia with the particular respect of a young man who has understood, belatedly, where the real work came from. The Hargroves fed them supper and asked questions about the federal process with the focused curiosity of people who have learned that understanding a system is better protection than hoping it works in your favor. And at the last stop, late in the afternoon of the 4th day, they sat at Ruth Dunmore's kitchen table one more time. Ruth had made pie. Margaret was there, because Ruth had invited her, and because Margaret Ellis was the kind of person who arrived at important moments as if she'd always been planning to be there. They ate pie and drank coffee and talked about what came next. The county land office restructuring that Judge Harlan had initiated, the appointment of a new land registrar, the formal review process that Callaway's office was implementing across 3 territorial counties to identify and correct any fraudulent transactions they hadn't yet caught. "There will be more," Amelia said. Vane was operating across 3 territories. Colorado is the most visible case, but New Mexico and Kansas have the same pattern. Someone needs to do there what we did here. "Callaway has 2 investigators already deployed," Benjamin said. "Investigators who are looking at it from the federal level. They need someone who can go into those communities and talk to the families." She looked at her coffee cup. "The families are the evidence. The documents matter, but the families are where the truth lives." Benjamin looked at her across the table. Is that what you want to do? He said. Go to New Mexico? Kansas? She thought about it honestly. She had not let herself think about it until this moment, because there had always been something more immediately urgent, and she had a lifelong habit of handling what was in front of her before looking at what was on the horizon. But the horizon was here now. The immediate work was done. And the question Benjamin was asking was not just about New Mexico and Kansas. She understood that, and he understood that she understood it. I want to do work that matters, she said. That's what I want. She looked at him steadily. What form that takes depends on a great many things. Such as? He said. Such as whether the man I'm apparently building a future with is the kind of man who would come to New Mexico with me, she said. Or whether he has 12,000 acres of cattle operation that require him to be in Colorado. Benjamin looked at her for a long moment. I have a very capable ranch manager, he said, who has been suggesting for 2 years that I travel less and trust him more. I have consistently ignored this advice. He paused. I'm beginning to think he had a point. He sounds like a sensible man, Amelia said. He is. I'll write to him. Benjamin's eyes held hers. New Mexico it is, if that's where you want to go. Across the table, Margaret Ellis looked at Ruth Dunmore with an expression that said, very clearly, that she had seen this coming from the moment Benjamin Hartwell sat down in her dining room with his hat on the table and asked for coffee. Ruth looked back with the expression of a woman who entirely agreed. Neither of them said a word, because some things don't need commentary. They were married in Red Hollow 6 weeks later, on a morning when the aspens had turned and the mountains were the color of something a painter would hesitate over because it would look too deliberate on a canvas. Margaret Ellis was the witness. Thomas Garvey rode up from Pueblo for it and arrived with his hat in his hand and a seriousness that made him look, briefly, like the man he was going to be in 10 years. Ruth Dunmore brought the cake. The ceremony was performed by the same judge who had suspended Crofts County authorization, Judge Harlan, who had made it clear that performing this wedding was one of the more satisfying duties he had discharged in his tenure, given what he now understood about the people involved and what they had done for his county. He said so out loud, briefly, in the direct way he said everything, and Amelia thanked him with the warmth of a woman who has stopped finding it difficult to receive acknowledgement gracefully. Benjamin said his vows looking directly at her, the way he looked at everything, without calculation, without reservation, with the full attention of a man who had decided this was the thing that mattered most and was not going to treat it as anything less. She said hers the same way. When it was done, when the simple words had been spoken and witnessed and recorded in the county register under her own name, alongside his, she felt something she didn't immediately have a word for. Not quite joy, not quite relief, something quieter and more durable than either. The feeling of a foundation that has been tested from every angle and has held and will hold because it was built correctly from the start. Margaret kissed her cheek and said nothing, which was how Margaret Ellis communicated the things that mattered most. Ruth pressed her hand and said, Daniel would have approved of him. High praise, Amelia said. The highest, Ruth said. Don't tell him that. He'll get comfortable. He already knows about the 12,000 acres, Amelia said. He hasn't gotten comfortable yet. Ruth laughed. It was the same laugh as that morning on the kitchen floor, the one that came from somewhere very deep and very real. And it was one of the best sounds Amelia had ever heard. They went to New Mexico in the spring. The case there took 4 months. The families were different, and the terrain was different, and the specific mechanics of the fraud were adapted to the local legal architecture, which required Amelia to build her understanding of New Mexico territorial land law from the ground up, using the church library in the town where they based their work. Benjamin made contact with the local federal office. They divided the labor the way they'd divided it in Colorado, him working the official channels, her working the communities, both of them at the table at the end of each day with what they'd learned, building the picture from both directions simultaneously. It worked the same way. Different names, different families, same fundamental truth. People who built things with their hands and their years deserved to keep them. And when someone tried to take that away from them by exploiting their trust in the systems that were supposed to protect them, The most useful response was to learn those systems better than the people weaponizing them, and then use that knowledge to make the weapons fall apart. 3 convictions in New Mexico. Full property restorations for 11 families. A federal procedural reform that Carl Whitfield contributed to in a consulting capacity, and that both he and Amelia spent 2 days arguing over in letters before arriving at language they both found satisfactory. Kansas took 5 months, partially because the fraud was older and the records were in worse condition, and partially because Benjamin's ranch manager wrote a series of increasingly plaintive letters about a fence line dispute that required a specific decision only Benjamin could make, and they had to stop in Colorado on the way to Kansas to deal with it. The fence line dispute was resolved in 2 hours. Benjamin apologized to his manager with the sincerity of a man who has realized he has been underusing an excellent person. His manager accepted the apology with the stoicism of someone who has been waiting for exactly this recognition for 2 years. "You were right," Benjamin told him. "I should have trusted you sooner." "Yes, sir," his manager said. "I know. I plan to continue being mostly elsewhere," Benjamin said, "with my wife, if that remains acceptable to you." "More than acceptable," his manager said, and meant it on approximately 4 levels simultaneously. In the years that followed, people in Colorado who knew the story, and most people in 3 counties did, because the story of the Hartwell land case had the specific durability of a thing that happened at a particular moment to particular people and mattered enough to be worth remembering. People told it the way stories get told when they're true and significant, incompletely, with the essential parts intact and the peripheral details shifting depending on who was telling it. They told it as Benjamin Hartwell's story, some of them, because he was the wealthy man, and the names of wealthy men stick to things. They told it as the story of the families who'd been defrauded and fought back, which was the most accurate version. They told it as a story about what federal law could do when it was applied with integrity, which was the version Calloway's office preferred. But the people who had been in Red Hollow during those weeks, Ruth Dunmore, Margaret Ellis, Thomas Garvey, Carl Whitfield, even Harold Fitch, who served his 18 months and moved west and became, by accounts that filtered back occasionally, a considerably more honest man than he'd been before. Those people told it differently. They told it as Amelia Whitaker's story, because it was. They remembered the woman who arrived in Red Hollow with $4 and a torn coat and rebuilt herself in the space of 3 weeks, while simultaneously building a federal case that 3 counties and a U.S. Marshal's office couldn't have constructed without her. They remembered the way she sat at kitchen tables and told women the truth about what was being done to them, in the clear and respectful language of someone who understands that people deserve to know the shape of their own situations. They remembered the evidentiary packages, and the continuance motions, and the message to Deputy Reeves, and the night Devereaux knocked on the door, and she answered it with the particular composed certainty of a woman who knows exactly what she's built and exactly why it holds. Ruth Dunmore told it to her grandchildren, decades later, when they were old enough to understand what it meant for a woman in 1878 to walk into a federal courthouse and be the one who made the case. She told them that Amelia Whitaker had been the most competent person she'd ever met, and one of the kindest, which were not qualities that usually live together in the same person, and which made for a combination that was, when deployed fully, very nearly unstoppable. She also told them, because Ruth Dunmore was a woman who believed in complete accounts, that Amelia had sat on her kitchen floor with her the morning the federal injunctions came through, and that a person could know everything about building a case and still need to sit on someone's kitchen floor sometimes, and that was not a weakness, but a form of honesty, and that the women who understood the difference between the two were the ones worth remembering. Margaret Ellis lived to be 84. Her boarding house outlasted every saloon in Red Hollow, which she regarded as an appropriate outcome and mentioned regularly in the last 20 years of her life. She kept the Colt revolver under her pillow until the end and never once had to use it, which she also regarded as an appropriate outcome, though for different reasons. Thomas Garvey became one of the most respected land attorneys in New Mexico Territory within a decade, which surprised no one who had seen him ride through the night with oilcloth-wrapped evidence and not once complain about the distance or the dark. He named his firstborn daughter Margaret Amelia, in that order, and sent an announcement to both women with a letter that was somewhat formal and entirely sincere, which was very much who he had always been. And Amelia Hartwell, though she kept Whitaker for professional purposes and used both names interchangeably for the rest of her life, because both were hers, and she had no patience for the convention that a woman's history before marriage was less real than the one that came after. Amelia built the life she had not been able to imagine in those long nights above Margaret's kitchen, when $4 and a torn coat had been the whole inventory of her future. She built it with her own hands and her own mind, and a man who understood that standing beside someone means staying level, not staying back. She built it out of the same material she'd always had. Her mother's belief that hard work was worth doing even when it wasn't rewarded. Her own knowledge that competence and kindness were not in competition, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been overlooked enough times to understand that being seen was not a requirement for being effective. The world did not always reward what it should. She had known that since she was 16, and had spent every year since knowing it and working anyway, because the work itself was the point, and the work held, and the things she built from it held, and that was enough. More than enough. It turned out to be everything. The woman who lost her job on a dark Colorado road because she stopped to help a stranger did not get back what she lost. She built something better, something that was entirely hers, built on her own terms, answerable to her own judgment and her own conscience, and the memory of a woman who had told her, very simply, that the world had enough people who looked away. Amelia Whitaker never became one of them. That was her story, and it held.